My name's John Stoner. The title of this talk is Data Sets That Can Make a Difference, Improving Your Detection and Hunting in Entra ID and O365. A little bit about myself. I've been doing this for a bit of time. You can kind of tell by the shade of the hair has kind of moved with that. A couple of things of note. I've built some adversary emulations around APT actors during the past couple of years. In fact, kind of one of the first places I heard about InsomniHack was when our extended team was actually coming and delivering a blue team capture the flag. So if you've ever played a blue team capture the flag here, maybe in the afternoon between 2018 and 2022, you've hopefully seen some of the scenarios that I've built as part of that. Hopefully they were fun and enjoyable. But anyhow, this is a little bit about me. We're going to go ahead and dive into the content because there's actually a lot here. My disclaimer here, I don't think I'm going to have any super spicy takes, but just in case, those opinions are mine if I share them and that such, not my employer. That's kind of important. And this is what we're going to cover during the course of today. We're going to do a brief introduction around Entra and O365 and its basic logging. And the reason I want to do that is kind of just make sure everybody's at the same level to get started. And I realize people are at different speeds in terms of this stuff. Just bear with me if that's stuff that you're going, yeah, I kind of know that already. Then I'm going to go into two different case studies, one around Golden SAML and one around Graph Runner. Golden SAML is a specific type of attack, fairly noteworthy. We'll cover that, just kind of baseline on that. Graph Runner is an adversary emulation tool, or a red teaming tool, if you will, and some things to learn from that. And then both of these kind of, at the end of the day, our focus here is to get at O365 resources, being able to get at email, SharePoint, OneDrive, right? So we're going to kind of start down this path. We're going to go down these two different paths, but really where we're trying to go is the same data stores, information stores behind it. So while it's its own section, we're going to kind of talk about it over here. We're going to talk about it over there. We're going to kind of talk about it throughout, okay? And the reason, one of the things I actually liked about this was, I don't know how many people sat in yesterday in Pravank's talk, which was like the first talk after the keynote, and he talked about Microsoft tokens and being able to access those via LSAS dumps. And then Alad and Ilan did the pass-through authentication stuff in the afternoon to be able to more easily get into your cloud environment through kind of a hybrid of Federation or a cousin of Federation, if you will. So this talk kind of bookends them very, very nicely because what we're focused on here is we're going to kind of assume breach because they showed us a lot of ways that you could breach. Right? So this is kind of the part after you get breached. What are the kinds of things I'm going to potentially be seeing within my log streams that I can better understand what's there, maybe instrument for those things, and maybe look to detect or hunt? All right. So foundationally, we've got Entra on the one side, cloud-based identity access system, formerly known as Azure Active Directory. I think I've gotten that out of my system, so it will be called Entra. If I say Azure AD, I apologize, but that's what that is. On the right side, Office 365. Now I think called Microsoft 365. Forget it. It's going to be Office 365 for my talk. I apologize for anybody who's calling it Microsoft 365. But these are our two main actors in this. The Entra ID component is that identity and access management. It's going to hook into resources like O365, the Azure portal, and all sorts of other goodness. O365 is where our information stores lie, right? So it's the classic Word and SharePoint, Excel and all that stuff. But more importantly for our talk, it's where Outlook is, where the mail is, where SharePoint is, where OneDrive is, where Teams is. And we don't have time to go through all of these different kinds of parts, but there are some definite places where there's some logging that's not too bad, there's some logging that's a little bit scary, and there's some logging that really could use some improvement. I guess that's my spicy take. All right, so the Microsoft Graph, again, one more foundational piece. I have links at the bottom just so folks can kind of go and look at this themselves. But this is the Graph. The Graph is kind of that backbone, if you will, that exposes all of these different kinds of services across Microsoft. And it's really, really nice from that perspective because it's kind of like I get in the vibe, I get into Graph, I authenticate into Graph, and then, you know, depending on my permissions, I kind of say, hey, I want this, or hey, I want that. But it also makes it very, very not very easy, but much simpler to be able to go ahead and gain access to these different pieces once I get into that graph itself. And that's kind of where we're going to start our story. So the basics of logging. These three data sets are probably the best understood sets of logging. If you are not logging these today, please log them. There is the Entra ID audit logs. There's the Entra ID sign-in logs. Those are interactive sign-ins. We'll talk about that in a bit. And then there's the O365 logs. At this point, most log management platforms, most SIMs out there, people kind of understand how to work with these things. There is some overlap between them, so you might be sitting there going, well, from a cost perspective, do I really want to grab both these sets of logs? And I'd say if you can, I probably would. We'll talk about where those overlaps exist. It's not going to be all encompassing, but you'll notice some weird quirks behind them. There's also some different SLAs between Azure AD audits and O365 audit logs. So when you expect to see them in, sometimes can vary depending on things that are happening, which again is just kind of oddities, but we'll talk about those. So let's start with Golden SAML. Golden SAML is nothing new. In fact, this was December 2020. Everybody probably remembers the SolarWinds Orion product, right? The supply chain, the malicious DLL, all of that terrifying stuff. Coupled that with pandemic, it was a good couple of months there, right? This attack was later attributed to what was called UNC 2452. Mandiant calls them APT 29. If you're old school Microsoft, you called them Nobelian. If you're new school, it's Midnight Blizzard. Did I cover everybody's threat groups? Hopefully. But the idea behind this was that was the supply chain piece. But DHS CISA in the US, and this is their advisory, had called out that, you know what, they also had observed initial access attempts where SolarWinds was not present, but Azure AD Entra, Azure AD at the time, now Entra, was with O365. And so there was some supposition there that Active Directory Federation Services, ADFS, which is kind of an on-prem piece, this was kind of a predecessor to PTA, which was talked about yesterday. Basically, a SAML token was obtained and basically used that to pivot to the cloud resources, okay? So this is kind of what that attack path looked like. And I apologize for those who like MITRE attack techniques. I have a MITRE attack technique. I followed by 3 MITRE attack tactics. And then I have a Lockheed Martin kill chain at the opposite end of it. So I've really mixed my metaphors. But the idea here is that these are kind of the steps of the process that this took. The first one on the far left was an on-premise attack around the Active Directory Federation Service to gain that SAML token. We're not going to worry about that. From a protection perspective, that is all on-premise kinds of good hygiene. And that's important, but that's not really the scope of the talk because we're talking more on the cloud side. Once that SAML token was captured, an access token was created using that signing key, and this is when our logging starts kicking in. From there, there is an application that's created, service principal created, permissions are created. It's important to understand with the graph, you have an application. That application has little holes poked in it, okay? Those are the permissions. Those are the ways that I get through to the different resources. How can I read the mail? How can I read the calendar? How can I update the calendar? Those kinds of things. And then there's administrative consent because there are certain kinds of permissions that require a little bit extra, okay? From a lateral movement perspective, I might want to go ahead and not log in through a first-party Microsoft app because that might start looking a little suspicious. So I want to create my own client secret and then log into that using my access token into this new application. Okay? And then finally, once I'm in there as in my custom application, I want to do stuff, right? All sorts of different things that you can do. So let's talk about the logging. The credential access aspect of this, when you create that access token, okay, it creates a token that you're given from Entra, and it's good for 60 to 90 minutes. It's random, okay? So it might be 60, it might be 90. We'll just say 75 for argument's sake. Azure AD and Office 365 both log interactive sign-ins, and they log them nicely. Who's the user? Who's the IP address? What application are they logging into? What's their user agent string? The kinds of things that you'd expect to have there. Probably some geographically enriched data as well, but that kind of stuff. Okay, so pretty basic so far. When you get into the privilege escalation step of this, there is the wanting to create an application because you don't want the application to be a first-party Microsoft app. You don't want to be logging in through Azure PowerShell or choose any of those other ones because, again, it starts looking a little weird over time. You have to create a service principal if you create an application. If you have to modify an application, you don't have to do that. You modify or add permissions, administrative consent. These are all logged things along the way. By the way, the create service principal and the modify permissions can happen in either order. It doesn't matter. But this is also where we start getting into, hey, these things are all kind of logged, which is a good thing, except for one thing, which is enumeration of something like the applications. Because if I want to be sneaky, I don't necessarily want to create a new application. I might want to go ahead and modify an existing application. So this is our introduction to one of the other data sets that we're going to talk about, an additional one. And this is the Microsoft Graph activity logs. So when I had first built an emulation around this to go through this, I was kind of horrified when I started doing my analysis of the data set that I didn't see a lot of reconnaissance, enumerations, the little mistakes that an adversary might make that kind of trip you up, that go, that's not really expected to happen. And the graph activity logs kind of help fill those gaps. Now, to ingest graph activity logs, you go to Entra ID in the diagnostic settings. You could click a little tick box, and you can send that data to a storage account, to an event hub. You might pull it with an Azure function out of there, and you throw it into whatever your log aggregation platform is. Doesn't matter. That last mile may vary depending upon your different one. I've done it both of these ways. It works perfectly fine. What can you see out of those graph activity logs? Well, the most important thing you can see is the graph URI. But I get the IP address, I get the user agent string, I get the user and service principal GUID, the location where it happened, the scope of the requester, right? How many permissions? When I say scope, that's permissions. And then the tenant and the application GUID that's associated with it, right? So I get a decent amount of information there. Maybe not everything that you want. I also, by the way, get the gets and the response codes as well, right? So I get the gets, the posts, the patches, the deletes, right? So when it comes to application creation, Azure Audit, O365 log those things very, very nicely when I create that app. Interestingly enough, Office 365 does not log the IP address in this kind of an audit thing, which is kind of weird, particularly because audit does. So again, this is where these kinds of little offsets happen. So when I create an application, these are actually two logs from the exact same creation. One was Azure Audit, one was O365. Their user agent strings are a little bit different, but all in all, you get a feel for, hey, somebody's creating an application in my tenant. Is that something I expect? They're going to go ahead and create some permissions. The good thing about permissions is there is a nice little link here called permissions reference. It has all of the GUIDs of all 400 permissions or so that exist within the Graph API. I'm not saying you have to memorize them, but they're good things to know, good things to have looking for. Do I care if mail.reads being set up? I might. Do I care if mail read writes being set up? Do I care about security events, right? What are those permissions that I might be a little bit concerned with somebody applying into their application that I might want to know about? Those are the kinds of things I might want to look for. The graph activity log will actually also log all of those big four events that we talked about. An application creation's a post 201, a permission's a patch 204. Service principal delegated permissions are also post 201s, and then you get the URLs that are going to it when you're hitting the OAuth 2 permission grants, the service principals associated with the applications, and so forth. So the graph activity gives you some nice, decent logs. I'm not saying I'd throw out my O365 or my Azure Audit, but it's a nice supplement to kind of fill in some of these gaps and doesn't leave you hanging there. When you get into that lateral movement with client secrets, all three of them log. They all log client secret. Client secret absolutely should be logged, and you probably want to be thinking about when are client secrets going to be created on a regular basis. And then that login back around again after I've created my app, right? I'm now logging into my app, not that first-party app, Microsoft app. Again, we get user logins, but O365 and Azure AD. Now, another interesting thing is that these two logins right here side by side are, again, one from Azure Audit, one from O365. One of them says Opera 95, and the other says Mozilla 5, blah, 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 Chrome 109, blah, 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 OPR 95. Again, two different log sources. The verbosity of the user agent, I don't even know if that's the real word, I just made that up. Verbosity, doesn't matter. Two different kinds of user agents, even though they're effectively the same one. So you're going to see them represented slightly differently. Again, if you're looking and doing user agent string analysis, you should be aware of that. All right, so we get to that actions on objective. I'm into this system. I'm doing stuff. This is where it gets a little more scary because, again, if I create a new user, Audit and O365 are logged. If I added somebody to the global admin role, absolutely, it's logged. But what about all of those other little things that you're doing or an adversary is doing as they're poking around that environment and enumerating and collecting information and exfiltrating it? Because the exfiltration is already in the cloud. You're not seeing that from any of your sensors, right? You don't see any of those things with Azure Audit or O365, but you do with graph activity. You may not see exactly what they're getting, but you're seeing the query request that's coming in. Some are better than others, but at the very least, I could see if somebody starts enumerating my global admins, that somebody's hitting the directory role for a specific GUID. That's helpful, right? If somebody's going ahead and enumerating the message rules, I could see that kind of a thing as well. So I could see those get 200s. The one that does not fall into that same bucket is enumeration of mail messages. Microsoft O365 will log what's called a mail items accessed if you go ahead and enumerate the mail message. Now, that having been said, We'll take a look at that a little bit later. It isn't great in terms of the information that's shared within that mail items access, but we'll talk a little bit about what's there and some differences with the API versus the UI. All right, so kind of put a bow around Golden SAML. Azure AD Audit, O365, they cover milestone events along the way, the big stuff, right? Permissions, client secrets, roles. O365 will give me exchange mail items accessed. Hey, somebody went through this SharePoint link. Hey, somebody read this file. Somebody opened this OneNote page. Hey, somebody set up an anonymous file download and then downloaded, right? Those kinds of things. Those things will be logged. But again, it's that stuff in the cracks that you're kind of missing to get that entire picture. So with things like the graph activity log, you have opportunities to hunt on things like roles. And I mentioned this real briefly. I enumerate my global admins, right? I've got a PowerShell script at the bottom there. I just ran it, right? Who are the admins in my tenant, right? I get a nice get 200 hitting the directory roles, role template equals blah. The blah there is a global admin, okay? I would think that, global admin, SharePoint admin, Exchange admin, those other kinds of more sensitive roles, if anybody ever hits you up on those, you probably want to know about them, right? I mean, you got to tune out maybe the noise, what are the things that you're doing as a normal course of business. But if anybody's hitting up on you on those roles, probably worthwhile kind of just seeing who's knocking at those doors. Okay. Other things, obviously, we can detect and create on application creation. Should everybody be creating applications in your environment? We'll come back to that one with GraphRunner in a second, but that's something to be thinking about. Should permissions be assigned excessively? I said there's 400 permissions or so inside the graph. How many of the people should be grabbing at a time in their applications? Which one should they be grabbing, right? Are client secrets rotated on a regular basis? Or do people create client secrets anytime they want to within the environment? Those are things we should be thinking about. The classic user logins where they're unexpected locations, logging into weird applications they've never seen before, and then, of course, accessing mail and data stores through unexpected applications. Again, those unexpected attack paths. And we'll talk about that one here in a bit, too, as we go into GraphRunner. All right. So GraphRunner, this was a PowerShell module. You can download this off of GitHub. It was released about 1.5 years ago from Black Hills Information Security. It has been improved upon. There's been some more stuff around MS Teams added into it. It has broken down into a number of functions, and honestly, it could probably make a day-long workshop out of all the different functions that are inside of this. They use this for red team engagements, but my biggest takeaway from this, looking through it, is when I was working through and kind of understanding and learning the Golden SAML stuff based on some other resources that are out there that we'll share at the end, there's, if you haven't done a lot of the API calls and everything else, there's a learning curve there, just like everything else. This really made it simple in terms of lowering that bar, because the functions were already built with the PowerShell calls. You put your options in there and things just kind of happen. They also added a UI to it, which, again, lowers the bar even further. Now, not all functions are inside of the UI, but there's a lot there. And so even simple things like, hey, I've got a token, I'm inside somebody's network, and I want to craft an email. Well, I don't have to sit there and worry about crafting the email and getting it formatted just rightly and everything else. They give me a nice little UI where I can sit there and go to, from, hi, start fishing internally. And off we go. So again, lowering that bar for folks to be able to get in there. GraphRunner is broken out into 5 distinct areas: authentication, recon, persistence, pillage, and supplemental. That's what they call them. Think of supplemental as being kind of the utilities and the defensive evasion. We're going to touch on at least 1 or 2 things from each one of these. Like I said, some of them have a half dozen, some of them have even more. I'll show you a lot of the modules, but we'll go into a couple of them as we go through. So this is the first one we'll talk about is initial access, right, via the authentication module. So there's authentication modules. There's one to authenticate into the Microsoft Graph, okay? So some of the stuff that they talked about yesterday in terms of having tokens, you lifted a token from somewhere, you could then potentially use that to authenticate. In our case, we're going to authenticate kind of through some more traditional methods, but token reuse is a real thing that you could potentially do, and I'll touch on that briefly towards the end of this. Similarly, with the pass-through authentications, the capabilities exist there that you could potentially pass through those authentications as well. You could also complete OAuth flows to an Entra ID application. We'll do that after we gain initial access, and you can refresh tokens periodically. Now, we just talked about access tokens. Access tokens are the ones that give you permission for the client, authorization, Golden SAML, 75 minutes, times cut off, interactive login, right? That's kind of the box. You want to go ahead and get a new token, that's fine. That's another interactive login. Why does John keep logging in to this thing every 75 minutes? Boy, that's kind of peculiar. The other kind of token, and again was mentioned yesterday morning, was the refresh tokens. There's two different settings for refresh tokens. There's a 24-hour one for a spa or a single-page app, and there's 90 days for all other scenarios. When I see things that are kind of curious, and the link here at the bottom is where this quote is drawn from, I like to kind of put quotes because this is not my words. This is, in this case, Microsoft's words, but they're saying refresh tokens replace themselves with a fresh token upon every use. We're good so far. The identity platform doesn't revoke old refresh tokens when used to fetch new access tokens. Okay, good to know. It's incumbent upon you, that's my word, not theirs, securely delete the old refresh tokens after acquiring a new one. Okay, I got to be concerned about disposal. Refresh tokens need to be stored safely like access tokens and application credentials. So if somebody's being careless with their tokens, as we talked about a little bit, it was talked about a little bit yesterday, this potentially is an avenue into the graph, because if I can go ahead and get those refresh tokens, it's not as simple as just picking up the refresh token off the floor and plugging it in. There's a few other things that you need. But that does raise the risk of being able to gain access to the graph. All right. So the first function that's out there, get graph tokens. Get graph tokens, you can do one of two things with it. You can use a user password auth, so it works for single-factor authentication. Now you might be thinking, does anybody do single-factor authentication? And the answer is yes, okay? MFA is mandated by Azure, okay? And they're moving more things to it. Some of it's gotten pushed back to summer of 2025. And things like O365 admins and Entra admin centers do absolutely need two-factor authentication. But a run-of-the-mill user who's just logging into O365 doesn't. And the thing about that is if I password spray an O365 user and I get their user ID and password, I'm now into the graph, I'm into the organization. I potentially could go ahead and work my way up the food chain to somebody who does have MFA and eventually get to where I actually want to be. So this still provides a low-level entrance into that if I can spray them or whatever else to get their password. So user password auth is one avenue. The more interesting one is the external call. This is the default. This is a code-based login. You probably have all seen code-based login somewhere else along the way. But if you're a multi-factor authentication and that's the target, this is the one you're going to be using. I'm going to mention this real briefly. There is the ability to forge a user agent string. There's a function in there. It's embedded into a number of other different functions. Obviously, you could take this PowerShell suite that they've got here and add it to other functions if you wanted to. But I'm going to show this just briefly because we're going to use it in our next step. You can go ahead and spoof out the device in the browser. They've got it hardwired and hard-coded into it, the different combinations. Again, for script kiddie capture, you could go ahead and load those up. I wouldn't lean too hard into that, but it's there. So this is what external call looks like. Okay, we're the dapper gent in the black hat there at the top. When we start the external call, a 15-minute clock starts. This is how this OAuth external call works. There's a 15-minute clock that starts with Entra, and Entra says, yeah, here's a 9-digit code, right? You need to enter the 9-digit code, and then you have to authenticate, okay? Now, the clock's ticking on us. What do? Well, we got to find a user who's going to click on this thing, right? Ideally, who's logged in to get them logged into MFA. And the thing on the right, by the way, I found this one in an Apple TV app, right? You guys have probably seen this in other forms and fashions. Basically, it's a code. You log in with that code. You provide the code. You provide your credentials, and you're in. This is code-based login. It's just a different flavor of that. But if you do log in with that, or your victim logs in with that, they come back to Entra and say, yeah, we're good. And then Entra redirects back to you and says, okay, here you go. Okay? And you're thinking, of course, why would anybody do this? Netscope wrote a really nice blog here about an example where they saw this happening in the wild. So I don't know if it's easy to see there. I'm just going to give you the highlights here. Who wants 1 terabyte of extra Outlook OneDrive space? Okay. Go to this site. It's a secure site. It is exactly the site that you're going to go to, Microsoft.com device login, code-based login. It's a legit site. It's absolutely what you want to do. Here's your code, right? That's the 15-minute piece. So that's my code. And enter your credentials, and you'll get your 1 terabyte in 24 hours. And then it even goes on to say, don't share your Office login. Make sure you use your two-factor, right? I mean, they're telling you all the good security hygiene stuff. So you enter your code, In mine, it pops it up and says pick an account because I had the login kind of stored there. This one is the one place that might be a clue that something might be off. My adversary infrastructure is sitting in Canada. So it says, hey, you're signing into Microsoft Office to a device located in Canada. Are you sure you want to do that? But if I had set it up in the States with my other infrastructure, it wouldn't even say that. It would just be like, hey, you're logging into Microsoft Office. Cool. Have a nice day. I put my two-factor authentication because I have two-factor authentication on that account. I put that in. It says, are you trying to sign into Office? I say, yeah, absolutely. And it says, fine, you're in. And you're in. Okay? Now I'm going to wait for my 1 terabyte. But in the meantime, what's happened is this graph token at the very, very top is what's been running in the background. It spits out a JWT payload. It goes ahead and provides the scope, the user, the IP address, all the good stuff, and it writes it to a global variable that has my access token and a refresh token available for me to go ahead and do with it what I want. Okay? And I'm in with Graph Runner, which brings us to the next data set. The next data set is for non-interactive sign-ins. And again, these came up a little bit yesterday. This is kind of where we start seeing refresh tokens being logged as non-interactive sign-ins. It's set up the same way as the graph activity logs. You click the tick box next to it. It's for non-interactive sign-ins. You point a place to forward it to, probably just a storage account, probably an event hub, maybe pull an Azure function, load it into your last mile wherever your log aggregation platform is. What does this look like from a defensive perspective? Well, I'm going to premise this with, this is looking at it from an Azure AD, Entra ID sign-in perspective. And I had on that switch, if you noticed, Android and Android Mobile as my Forge browser. Okay? At the bottom there, I get my login. It's a block, right? Because it's two-factor authentication, so you're blocked. Notice I'm logging into Firefox 135 here, right? So I'm on my system. I'm logged in with what? I'm trying to log in with that with 135. I will also mention, interestingly enough, that the IP address is the adversary system, which kind of is interesting as well. My MFA is secured in the next step and says, yep, your MFA is good, right? Because I put that two-factor authentication in. And then about 2 seconds afterwards, I get a non-interactive sign-in. And in that non-interactive sign-in, it says MFA requirement satisfied by the claim in the token. And you'll notice my user agent string now has flipped to Linux U, Android 4.02, Galaxy Nexus build, blah, 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 Safari 534. So when the non-interactive sign-in kind of kicked in there, it kicked in with that forged token or forged user agent string that I was using. I'm not showing it here just because time and everything else. O365 actually logs every one of those code attempts. So if you've got a lot of those code things running through, you'd see a bunch of those. But a couple other things interesting that happen. Like I said, the user agent's graph runner command is issued aligned. The log stream there's a session ID in the O365 log stream that is there and then disappears. Again, weirdly enough, Azure sign-ins do not have that level of detail. And then the application in the app on the far right-hand side switches from being Azure Active Directory to the target application that we were attempting to log into. By default, Graph Runner logs into Microsoft Office. Sorry, so I don't trip myself. Well, we might trip ourselves. We have O365. But you could actually force somebody to log into MS Teams, into a custom application. There's lots of different places that you could log into. So there's some weirdness that go on when the non-interactive sign-in kicks in and changes some of those user agent strings. Again, some peculiar stuff. Once you have access, again, 75 minutes on that token, but hey, I want some extra time. I could go ahead and run the invoke refresh graph token. Basically, I take that graph token that I've stored in my global variable, I run it, boom, you get your extra 75 minutes, and there is one interactive login that goes in the background there that says, yeah, you still satisfied the claim, you're good, let's keep on going. The problem with interactive sign-ons and the challenge that we've got is that these things happen all the time. You guys ever think about, like, when it says, do you want to stay signed in? And you say, yeah, right? That's the interactive tokens that are just kind of happening in the background, right? And we do this all the time. So this data set's a kind of a tough one because there's lots of other normal stuff that's happening around it. But it does provide some visibility into some of these other things that are happening that are just kind of off. So we'll talk about that in a little bit later as we get into applications. We've got our initial access. Where do we want to go from there? We want to go recon and enumeration. This comes back to graph activity logs. This saves our bacon. There's a bunch of different things it does. I'm not going to go into all of these. I can tell you every single one of these things is not seen by audit or O365 except for there's one of the ones around open mailbox, which you'll see, but everything else here is dependent upon graph activity logs. Otherwise, you do not see any of these things. The tenant ID, by the way, doesn't happen on your tenant. It actually happens on a Microsoft system, so you won't ever see anybody doing that, but you can enumerate anybody's tenant ID with a, if you know what their domain is. Conditional access policy, actually, everybody's kind of hosed on collectively because nothing logs conditional access policies being enumerated. That's just kind of how it is. But the rest of the stuff we can see. So what's something I would want to do initially? We talked about enumerating the applications before. We want to go ahead and invoke dump apps. This function is very, very noisy. It hits the service principal, the application, the organization, and the user endpoints. And then it recursively goes through the applications and starts looking to say what are the permissions that each of those applications are set up have. So there's a pretty high fidelity alert there if somebody's going ahead and dumping all of these things out. Again, now, what are you going to do about it? That's a good question, but at least you're kind of seeing that, hey, somebody's working through my applications and trying to figure out all the permissions that are there. The open inbox finder, right? Why would anybody else have access to anybody else's inbox? Well, people go on vacation, maybe it's a shared inbox, maybe they misconfigured, things happen, right? This one allows you to go through and enumerate the inboxes of the users, basically my token, the token that I have, which inboxes can I read, right? Again, this is a little chatty, right? But it'll return a get 403, a get 200, a get 404, depending upon the mailboxes. I've got a couple examples there. The one place, this is the O365 place where the mail items accessed is logged, is if I get a get 200, it's going to return the first line of the mailbox, like the first message in the mailbox that I get for that hit. So that would be a place that I might be able to go, oh, okay, I see that if I just had the O365 data. Okay, but we'll talk about the APIs and mail items accessed in a bit and why that's problematic. But this gives me another opportunity to sit there and go, wow, I've got a lot of 403s going to all these different inboxes in my environment. That seems kind of strange. Or, a lot of 404s or what have you, right? So again, this is kind of the weird stuff where people are knocking at the door. You can see 429 throttling as well. I started seeing a lot more throttling more recently than I did before as I was kind of hammering through these things. The recon commands all use a user agent string of the console they're running. So my stuff has a lot of PowerShell 7.3 as an example in there. Your mileage may vary. And obviously people could recompile it and change these things. The other thing is you also see session IDs being constant. So if you have an interactive login, right? I do my interactive login, then I start scanning all of these different pieces of my tenant. The graph activity logs are all going to have the same session ID until I refresh my token again. So again, if I'm trying to kind of group activity and kind of say, hey, here's some like activity, session ID is a good way to do that in the graph activity logs. There's also a funky little API called estimate access. And the idea behind estimate access is it submits an action and then it kind of goes out there and says, well, can you do this thing based upon the permissions and rights you have? What's odd about it is an undocumented API. Okay, and I've gone back and kind of looked periodically to see if there's anything more. It's still kind of sitting in the beta section, but there really isn't a lot written about it. I've seen it pop up in my log stream when I use the Azure portal to do like normal administrative functions, right? So you can't sit there and say, aha, we've seen this, it's bad, okay? But it is something to kind of continue to poke at and kind of ask yourself, okay, I know my admins are doing this in the Azure portal, but I keep seeing these things over in these other places. Is that potentially a hunt point to go ahead and start looking at some other different things associated with it? All right. Once we kind of know what our environment looks like, we want to go ahead and do some persistence. You could add a group member, add a user to a group. You could clone a group. Okay, you could go ahead and invite a guest, or you could go ahead and do the inject OAuth app. Easy for me to say. All of these things are logged fairly robustly. I will mention that by default, in your Azure tenant, invite guest, create application, create group is available for all users by default. Okay, so if you do nothing else or take nothing else from this talk, that might be something to think about. Or are those three things something that I want to have turned on by default within every single Azure tenant out there? And there's actually a recon command that'll go ahead and enumerate that and show it to you as well that we didn't cover. Okay. So the inject app, right? This is, I've got access. I figured out what the environment looks like. I would create my own app so I kind of look a little stealthier, right? And also provides a stepping stone, because what I can do is I can go ahead and try to get a higher level user out there to be able to give me access to his or hers application and scope. The other nice thing about the application is it's not time bound. So I could set this thing up, and keep in mind, I'm already inside the house. So if I start phishing, right, and I start communicating, I could use Teams, I could use OneDrive, I could use SharePoint, I could use comment sections. So think about all the different ways you could communicate internally that you have a much more gravitas when you're communicating with this. And I can just have this listener set up to redirect this OAuth code when the person says, okay, yeah, I need to authenticate that app. That's why this gets a little bit scarier from that perspective. So the high-level flow looks like this. You're going to go ahead and run the invoke inject OAuth app to Entra. Entra is going to go ahead and spin up an application for you. It's really, really easy. It actually is almost wizard-like in the sense of like, here's the information that we created. Here's the code that you need to run on your other system. Here's the listener you need to set up, and so forth. And oh, by the way, once you get all these other pieces of information, paste what they gave you with this, and that kind of completes the loop. You can set this up off-box, or you could go ahead and set this up on-prem, or if you look at the folks from Black Hills, when they set it up on an Azure service that they set it up for. But anyhow, you set up your listener, you run your Python code, you're going to send that URL to the user. That URL is obviously going to be a little bit stealthier than the big long code that you've got there. That user, you can wait, and you can be as casual as you want to. You might sit there and go, man, we've got the contractors coming, we need this app set up, right? The compelling event. They click on it at some point, the redirect happens to OAuth, and then you complete the loop to go ahead and gain your access. They would see something like this. You guys have probably seen this at some point. This is a greedy app, okay? This is setting up the, hey, we're going to set up the R&D project fish, and we're using what's called OP backdoor, which is set up inside the system. OP backdoor is not taking things that require administrative consent, so they're kind of lower level permissions, but they are powerful things like read the email, send the email as you, create chats, edit the channels, right? So some pretty meaty things potentially. But if you get a little greedy and you send them a thing that looks this long, they might not click on it, or they might make a phone call. But if you condense that down and you're not greedy and you're focusing on just the mail or focusing just on the chat, you might get somebody to go ahead and say, yep, accept. And if they consent on behalf of your organization, that's like added bonus. The creation of the application is logged, right? We talked about that before. O365 logs it. Service principal, secret key, application, right? Graph activity, Azure AD audit, all the same things, right? This is the same thing we did with Golden SAML, right? You can kind of see this is a good way, a time-tested way of gaining these accesses. So all of these things are logged, right? So that's good. The first thing is, if I'm looking at these kinds of things, why are people creating creating applications? Why are they creating it with all these permissions? Why are they creating these client secrets? Hopefully we're asking those questions to start with in general. But once this thing goes out there and we go ahead and set up our listener and we fish away like there's no tomorrow, we eventually get that user to click. Audit and O365 will create a consent to application, add app role assignments to user, add service principal, add delegated permission grant, and then finally there's the interactive login of that user logging in. Okay. Interestingly enough, when we fished to that, it was showing the internal IP address of the place where the user clicked on those links, and then obviously the information that went ahead with it. When we closed that loop, because we took that OAuth token and added it to our last command here, we got another interactive sign-in. That interactive sign-in still used the same IP address of the victim system where they clicked, which is kind of interesting. The user agent string showed us PowerShell 7.3, so no forge on that. And then the application ID is the GUID of the application that we created. And in my case here, it actually says over there R&D Project Fish, because that's what my logging stream says there as well. So you get all of those different pieces, but you get that as an interactive sign-in. So again, without the interactive sign-in, you wouldn't see that last piece of the hook happening. Now, you can refresh application tokens on a regular basis, but you need a few more pieces of information. You need that client ID for the application. You need the secret. You need a redirect URL. You need the refresh token. You don't really need the scope. It's optional. But my point there is if you're doing this from an adversary perspective and doing this, don't lose those pieces of information. Don't close that PowerShell console and you lose all those variables, because otherwise you're going to be kind of sad and you'll have to refish. All right. Subsequent graph activity logs will show the GUID for that specific application. So again, if I'm not expecting an application, or I know we'll have a good feel as to what applications I'm monitoring for, and I start seeing an application that I don't monitor against, that should be something that bubbles up and saying, well, I'm monitoring for these things, and I'm hunting for this information around this project that I didn't have a week ago. That might be something good to look at. All right, once I'm in, we're going after information stores again. So there's a bunch of things you can do. I'm not going to cover Teams today. Teams, I feel like it could be its own separate talk. I would say I haven't felt really great about the amount of information and the log stream that's available with Teams. I don't know about your mileage. Your mileage may vary. If you are having good success with that, that's great. But looking at it, I'm kind of like, I feel like there's a lot of things that potentially are leaking out and you're not getting visibility into that. So I'll just kind of throw that one out there. If I wanted to go ahead and get email, then this is kind of where I want to get into the difference between what Outlook looks like or mail messages look like versus the Graph API activity logs, and why I like the Graph API activity logs is I might do something like this. I'm going to enumerate my user, or I'm going to go ahead and dump the inbox of the user Tim Smith. I'm going to say, give me 500 email messages and write it out to a text file, right? What do I see? I see these two things. No Azure audit logs. That's fine. Not expecting them to be there. My Graph activity log is the one at the top. I get the IP address, that's my adversary IP. I get a get 200, okay. I get the URL, and the URL says, user, Tim Smith, mail folder, inbox, messages, top 500. Okay, at least I know what's happening. If I look at the 4 underneath that, what do I have? These are O365 logs. Mail item accessed, mail item accessed, mail item accessed, mail item accessed. What's the user agent string? Client rest, client rest, client rest, client rest. How about that IP address? Does anybody know what that IP address is? Doesn't matter what that IP address is, but it's part of Microsoft's IP space. Okay? In fact, if you start looking, and this was published, CISA published this at the very, very beginning of this year, probably worth taking a look at. They provide some more additional explanation around logging, Office 365 logging there. But if you look at this, there is user interface web access. So I log into my browser on my system and I check my mail, right? I have UI client. I log into my system. I downloaded the Outlook client and I'm running the client, the XE on my system. And then of course we have the API. These 3 different ways to be able to get at that data log in different manners. The IP address will always be the IP address of the system that is accessing the mail if you are using the UI web or the UI client. If you're using the API, it's a Microsoft address. Okay? If you see in your log stream mail access type sync, that indicates an Outlook client, a hard client, an XE, right? And then if you see client application IDs in there, then you'll know what applications the APIs are using to access mail. So again, if I see in my mail items accessed and I see a client app ID, like the 2 at the bottom here, okay, the one's actually a system one, I think it's MS Graph, but the one below it is an application. I probably want to look and have a good feeling as to who is accessing mail through what applications in my environment. I might have 3 or 4 apps that use Entra ID, poke holes in through those apps to get at my mail, but what's this 5th one, right? Or should I have 5? Should I only have 1? These are the kinds of things that you might want to look at from the log perspective as well. If we wanted to get at information stores like SharePoint or OneDrive, they've got a nice little function here where I could go ahead and put a search term in like file type PDF, and it'll dump out the PDFs that I have available based on my token access, whether it's the app token or the graph token. It outputs things like the name, the location, the last modified creation, and you get a little bit of a file preview, and then it gives you a drive ID and an item ID, which are really, really awful, right? There are these long strings like that. But it then prompts you and says, hey, do you want to download it? And you say, yeah, sure, go ahead and download it. And it'll go ahead and download. Now, from a logging perspective, this gets really tough because there is a search query endpoint. So the initial search, it's not like mail where it says, oh, top 500 messages. It's just search query. That's it. So in terms of somebody trolling around in there, the graph activity log doesn't really help you that much. Sorry. But when you get to the download, Office downloads generate a get 302. Office activity logs, Office logs show download. Graph activity logs show a get 302. There's an invoke file download function that does that. Basically, the logging for that are these two things here. This is also where it gets a little bit nice to have both. Graph activity logs will show you that nice, ugly drive ID, item ID, right? Office 365 will tell you it's shared documents, finance 2023, budget addendum 06/7/27/23. Something very human readable, right? Which can be helpful as well. So there's a difference there between the two. They actually both show the correct IP. They show the IP of the adversary downloading it or the user downloading it. All right. We're in the home stretch here. The additional functions. We're not going to cover all of these. The evasion techniques, there's a couple different ways to do that. We'll touch on the deletion of the application. Maybe you want to clean up your system on the way out the door. You can do a delete OAuth app. However, that's only a soft delete, so it is still there. O365 logs this. Azure AD Audit logs this. They did the log the deletion and the service principal. That's about all I want to say on that one. There is a hard delete. Hard delete is a separate login, but you can't do that from inside the function, nor do I recall. I don't think you can do it from the API. I think you have to do the hard delete from the portal itself. So let's talk about refresh tokens real quick one more time. The refresh token itself does not provide access, right? If you're in a graph token, you need to know what the client ID is to apply that refresh token to. And if you're in an application token, then you have to know the client ID as well as the client secret. So again, it's not as simple as just taking a refresh token and throwing it in. But if you start seeing these things and you need to go ahead and kill some of them off, you can. The problem is that you can't configure the lifetime of a refresh token. You used to be able to. Microsoft changed that. I imagine there's a number of really good reasons to do that. They do 24 hours for the spas, 90 days for the others. But there's a couple things you can do to help address this. The first is you can modify your conditional access policies. Conditional access policies, definitely would recommend you taking a look at those. You can force a user to have to sign in on a more frequent basis. Right? And you can do that also with geographies and all sorts of other things. But you can say, you know what, we're not going to use those refresh tokens forever, right? We're going to make sure you're logging in on a somewhat regular basis. Now, again, this is the security versus convenience that we got to balance in our organizations. There is a thing called token protection. It's still sitting in preview. I looked yesterday. This sits on top of conditional access policies. The idea with that token protection preview is that you can't do that, taking it from over here and using it over there, but that's something to be mindful as well. The other thing I want to talk about with revoking refresh tokens, and this is a little bit of a challenge that I think if you find yourself that you need to revoke tokens, you've practiced this and you know what to do because they're changing things. Okay. Azure AD PowerShell was deprecated in 2024. It'll stop functioning the end of March 2025. That would be, a few weeks from now, right? And apparently you can extend it. You can request extensions. But these two revoke token commands will no longer work unless you have an extension. Okay, so there's new token commands that are using the Microsoft Graph PowerShell, and that's fine. But again, if you find yourself in a situation where you need to be pulling these things off real quickly, you probably want to be versed as to how to do it. So this is a screenshot of it. Basically, they've got some information around it, but you got to connect the MG graph, you set your scope, you go ahead and point at the user specifically that we had there, we update the user, revoke the token, and off we go. But again, it's a new process to learn. If I see this from the adversary side and I try to go ahead and run my refresh token, all I'm going to get is a 400 bad request. On the other side of this, from a defender perspective, you'll get a fresh auth token is needed. Have the user re-sign using fresh credentials. It'll be a block, and it'll be that non-interactive sign-in log again. Okay? Now, just because somebody needs a fresh auth token doesn't mean everything's bad, right? There's probably other reasons why somebody has an auth token that's expired. That's potentially legitimate, but it's something to be thinking about if you started instrumenting these things and pulled some of these things in a little bit tighter, something else to be mindful of. So the attack flow with Graph Runner, like I said, we kind of talked about this. We start with that auth, we get that initial foothold, we enumerate, we go into that pillage mode. What can I find from that user that I went ahead and have their token? Then I want to persist. I want to go ahead and put that user into a group. I want to create an application, whatever those things are, so I can kind of loop back around, get the next authentication. Okay, what does this user have? And again, because I'm in the door with that first user that maybe I just sprayed the user to get into their O365, I build up more more credibility because I'm inside the house and I'm the guy asking for more resources as Mike or Bob or Jim or whoever that is, but I'm not just some random external guy. I'm fishing internally, right? And that gets a lot scarier. And then, of course, the defensive evasion at the end if I want to clean up my tracks on the way out the door. So the graph and the interactive stuff can be a little bit challenging, right? You got to find the right signal to noise ratio. I can tell you in a very, very meta kind of way that when I poll for logs for the graph activity, it creates more logs because I've polled, right? Hey, what do you have? Oh, that's a log because you just polled for it. So there's some tuning that has to happen. In fact, Microsoft services like Defender Cloud apps are legitimate API calls as well that you're going to have to filter out, because otherwise you're going to be like, hey, Microsoft, what do you got? Hey, Microsoft, what do you got? Right? You want to filter those out as well. They have some network requirements there that they say, hey, here's where you're going to get that stuff from. You could filter those things out as well. So there's some tuning that goes into this. But because these things are all as designed, okay, and the tokens granted, you got a lot of space to drive through. So log O365, absolutely. If you can, I'd log audit and logins as well. If you can do that, on top of that, I would strongly look at the Graph API activity logs. And then on the cherry on top would be the non-interactive sign-ins, because while they're noisy, they give you visibility on those refresh tokens you might not see otherwise. And as the folks talked about yesterday, those are things to be mindful of. Think about that refresh token policy and the frequency of logins. You can modify that via the cap. And then also think about the default access that users should be allowed to have in Entra ID. Should they be able to create apps? Should they be able to create groups? Should they be able to invite other people? Think about those kinds of things. If you want to check out some other things, the Golden SAML stuff, I built this off of some of the Simulan lab guides. I modified it to my own thing, but they did some great work there, so use that as a starting point. The Graph Runner folks, they've got a nice video and blog out there. Invictus had written up a couple of initial things that were nice. They were more on the IR side of this and less on the SecOps and hunting side, but still some good information. And then I've written a bunch of hunting and detection rules around YARA-L that are available out there as well. And with that, I think I've hit the time. Thank you all for your time. My LinkedIn, my Blue Sky, my Mastodon that I don't go to very frequently is there. And I'll be here for a few minutes if you want to chat more about it. But thank you very much for your time.